Good day, everyone. Today, we will be presenting auditing contracts and the purchasing function. Purchasing activities can take many forms, ranging from the comparatively straightforward acquisition of the consumable items required for everyday business through sourcing supplies required to keep a production process running smoothly to sophisticated procurement contracting processes, perhaps involving the selection of the appropriate suppliers and tendering procedures. Starting off, we have control objectives and risk and control issues. For each area, we shall examine the component functions and highlight the relative control objectives and the risk and control issues arising from the various constituent activities. To save space, we have concentrated on the objectives to be stated. For the control objectives for purchasing, first we have ensure all purchasing activities are supported by authorized and documented policies and procedures, ensure that purchasing appropriately supports the business objectives, ensure that the appropriate goods or services are obtained at the optimum price and at the relevant time, ensure that all purchasing activity is valid, justified, and authorized within the prescribed budgets, ensure that suppliers are reliable, financially stable, and able to satisfy the organization's purchasing demands, ensure that all goods and services are of an appropriate quality to satisfy the organization's objectives, ensure that the supplier's trading terms and conditions are appropriate, ensure that purchasing activities comply with all the prevailing legislation and regulations, ensure that all purchasing activity is correctly reflected in the organization's stock control records and accounts, ensure that overdue and late deliveries are progressed, ensure that the supplier performance is adequately monitored and reached to, and lastly, to provide management with adequate, accurate, and timely information on purchasing activities. These control objectives are broad in nature. The purchasing motivation and approaches of various organizations will be subject to variation in respect of scale, nature, market pressures, and potential operational impacts. For example, there will be inevitably be different emphasis placed on the approach adopted for purchasing between the public and private sectors or between a service organization and an engineering company. Moving on to contracting. For many organizations in both the private and the public sector, contracting activities can represent a significant degree of risk. In this section, we will define a comprehensive universe of functions and activities associated with contracting, and from that broad universe, make a selection of more generally applicable processes for further detailed examination of the related issues. Contract Contractual relationships can take many forms and indeed relate to a wide range of activities. Example, major civil engineering projects in the public sector or specialized goods and service procurement in the private sector. The contracting approaches applied in these different scenarios will vary in form and scale and may be affected by sector-specific regulations and practices. In order to take account of this potentially wide-ranging scope of contracting activities, we will present an audit universe structure divided into three distinct areas. Note that not all the activities listed will apply in every organization. So, this is the suggested audit universe. Number 1. Contract management, environment, and pre-contract processes. First is contract management environment, for example, procedures and methods. Second is project management framework, then project assessment and approval. Moving on to engaging, monitoring, and paying consultants design, assessing the viability and competence of contractors, maintaining an approved list of contractors, tendering procedures, contract and tendering documentation, insurance and bonding, selection and letting of contracts. Second is the during the currency of the contract. First is the management information and reporting, then performance monitoring, arrangements for subcontractors and suppliers, materials, plant and project assets, valuing work for interim payments, controlling price fluctuations, monitoring and controlling variations, extensions of time, controlling contractual claims, and liquidations and bankruptcies. The last one is upon and after contract completion. First is contractor's final account, then recovery of damages, then review of project outrun and performance, and lastly, maintenance obligations.
Contract management environment. What is contract management? Evan Stinson states that contract management is the process of managing contracts from creation to execution and eventually termination or renewal of the contract. In situations where the level of contracting activity justifies the establishment of an overall contract management environment, there is a broad range of component issues to consider. For example, project viability, authority to proceed, contractor competence and reliability, fair tendering processes, regulatory compliance, and many more. With that, the control objectives for the contract management environment are the following. First, to ensure that contracting activities support the cost-effective achievement of agreed business objectives. Second, to provide and maintain suitable documented procedures to effectively administer contracting activities and prevent staff malpractice and fraud. Third, to ensure that contract requirements are correctly identified, appraised, justified, and documented. Fourth, to ensure that the optimum contracting solution is selected. Fifth, to ensure that contracts awarded represent value for money and meet the required quality and performance standards. Sixth, to ensure that only stable, financially secure, and appropriately qualified contractors are engaged. Seventh, to ensure a fair and equitable basis for selecting contractors. Eighth, to ensure all requirements and objectives are identified, documented, and met. Ninth, to ensure that all payments against the contract are valid, authorized, and correctly accounted for. 10. To ensure that contracts are completed on time, within budget, and to the required standard. 11. To ensure that responsibilities are identified and allocated. 12. To ensure that management information is accurate, appropriate, complete, and timely. 13. To ensure that progress is adequately monitored and that problems are promptly reacted to. 14. To ensure that all statutory and regulatory issues are identified and correctly addressed. 15. To ensure that the most appropriate form of contract is utilized and that the organization is adequately protected in the event of contractor default. 16. To ensure that any design requirements are fully explored and accurately communicated. 17. To ensure that subsequent design changes are authorized and minimized. 18. To ensure that delays and extensions of time are reported, minimized, and authorized where necessary. 19. To ensure that price fluctuations throughout the contract are justified, authorized, and correctly applied. 20. To ensure that contractual claims are minimized, controlled, and satisfactorily resolved. 21. To ensure that all project assets, plant, and materials are adequately protected and correctly accounted for. And lastly, to ensure valid claims for damages are correctly raised, pursued, and settled. Given those objectives, why is contract management important? Contracts are the foundation of business relationships. They spell out every aspect of a business deal or supplier relationship from start to finish. All contracts must be managed for their entire life cycle, leveraging any negotiated clauses, monitored for compliance, and then reviewed for amendments or renewal. Companies can open themselves up to countless risks, financial penalties, and contract compliance issues without proper contract management. A small technical mistake or wording issue can cost thousands of dollars in the long run. World Commerce and Contracting Research reveals that poor contract management costs businesses over 9% of their annual revenue. Thus, companies should implement effective contract management. Accordingly, contract management determines whether contracts are mainly risk factors or vehicles for business growth. In reality, how a company handles its contracts affects its bottom line.
Assessing the viability and competence of contractors. Irrespective of the scale of contracting activity, there is a universal justification for ensuring that the potential contractor is at the least capable, financially stable, and operates to recognized standards. Where the contracting activity or project is critical to the ongoing survival and operations of employing organization, it becomes essential to conduct a detailed assessment of contractors. The following are control objectives. Number 1. To ensure that only stable, financially secure, and appropriately qualified contractors are engaged. This is to ensure that the contractors hired will not commit fraud or action that will make the company lose its resources. Number 2, to ensure that contractors have sufficient and appropriately skilled resources to meet the contract obligations. In order for the company to be assured that the service provided by the contractors will bring quality and satisfaction. Next, to ensure that contractors are selected fairly and without bias or favor. Number 4, to ensure that adequate security is available in case of contract breach. Number 5, to ensure that the contract has appropriate and adequate insurance cover and is maintained throughout the contract. Next objective is to ensure that contractors with propensity for contractual claims are identified and avoided. Furthermore, according to Alcumus Group, contractor assessment is commonly split into 2 stages. The first one is the pre-qualification assessment. This determines whether contractors have generally compliant in the health and safety management systems and competency to carry out work before being allowed on site. The second is project-specific assessment. This focused on whether the contractor has the appropriate experience, project-specific documentation, and competency. Consequently, assessing the viability and competence of contractors is necessary for successful contractor management. A firm needs to ensure that its contractors can undertake the work required from them and have suitable arrangement to ensure that this is carried out safely. Always remember that you are allocating your company's resources.
Maintaining an approved list of contractors. For an organization like a local authority is regularly involved in seeking contractors for similar projects, it may be necessary to maintain an approved list of reliable, trustworthy, and stable contractors as a basis for selection, perhaps using tendering. Thus, this section examines what surrounds the maintenance of approved lists. The following are the control objectives. First, to facilitate the selection of financially stable, competent, and reliable contractors. Second, to ensure that contractors can achieve the required quality and technical standards. Third, to ensure the selection of contractors with sufficient and appropriate resources. Fourth, to ensure that selection of contractors is based on fair and realistic criteria. Fifth, to ensure that relevant data is accurate, complete, and maintained up to date. Sixth, to ensure that data is protected from unauthorized access, amendment, and leakage. And lastly, to ensure that all regulatory and statutory requirements are addressed. The stated objectives are interconnected. Hence, to attain those objectives, the management shall conduct a pre-qualification to identify contractors who are qualified in terms of the criteria, such as their level of industry-related experience, legal eligibility, financial status, technical competence, previous performance, training records, and resources. They must thoroughly evaluate if the potential contractors have the required competence with the contract terms, eliminate unqualified contractors from the start, progressively gauge the existing contractors, and update the list accordingly to prevent engagement with incapable contractors. The management shall also assess if the contractors follow the requirements, specifications, or guidelines that can be used consistently to ensure that materials and processes are fit for their purpose. They must ensure that the listing and selection criteria comply with the generally set standards and guidelines. In the case where pre-qualification is already conducted, only pre-qualified contractors are eligible to bid on the contract. Next are the tendering procedures. Where an organization is obligated to demonstrate fairness and value for money when selecting contractors, it may choose to put contract bids out to tender. The principal aim is to ensure that the optimum tender is selected for the job, having regard for economical, quality, stability, and technical issues along the way. But first, what is tender? In this system, the entity invites contractors to give their quotations. Generally, the one with the lowest quotation wins the contract. However, project owners must realize that the lowest tender or price may not necessarily be the most advantageous. According to the International Association of Dredging Companies, tenders are usually conducted in 4 stages. First, the pre-qualification, which is explained earlier in the maintenance of approved list. Second, the issue of tender documents. Third, receipt and review of tenders. And lastly, the awarding of contracts. Furthermore, to help with the tendering procedures, the following are the control objectives. First, to ensure that tendering is the most appropriate and cost-effective form of contractor selection in the circumstances. Second, to ensure that the best value for money is obtained when selecting contractors. Third, to ensure that the most suitable and appropriate form of tendering is applied and justified. Fourth, to ensure that matters of contractor reliability, stability, and technical competence are adequately addressed. Fifth, to ensure that authorized and documented tendering procedures are in place. Sixth, to ensure that the tendering process incorporates adequate competition. Seven, to ensure that the tendering process is fair and free from personal bias or undue influence. 8. To ensure that the tendering instructions are accurate, complete, and unambiguous. 9. To ensure that the tendering documentation is accurate and complete. 10. To ensure that an adequate and workable tendering timetable is applied and adhered to. 11. To ensure that tendering process is fairly conducted and that fraud and collusion are prevented. 12. To ensure that tendering process is relative to the type of contract and conforms to any legislative or regulatory requirements. 13. To ensure that appropriate internal procedures are in place to protect the recording, handling, storage, and assessment of submitted tenders. 14. To ensure that submitted tenders are protected from unauthorized access, opening, amendment, or leakage. 15. To ensure that all contractors are treated equally and fairly. 16. To ensure that all tenders are impartially and appropriately reviewed as the basis for selection. 17. To ensure that errors, qualifications, and omissions are detected and objectively dealt with. And lastly, to ensure that the optimum tender is authorized for selection. Regardless, how can these objectives be achieved? When starting tendering procedures, employers and consulting engineers should be aware that the fewer details given and the lesser the specifications and information contained in the invitation to the prospective tenderers, the greater the risk that irresponsible bidders will participate. While on the other hand, the smaller the risk to be borne by the contractor, the better the comparison of the various tenderers can be affected. Besides, the procedure to receive and review tenders will fall within the employer's strict deadlines and policy guidelines. These methods should be identified, documented, and understood by all parties. The employer will review tenders and decide on which contractor has the capability and resources to meet the stipulated requirements. These reviews will consider risk evaluation and allocation. Employers should be wary that if risks are difficult to evaluate, some marginally qualified contractors may offer lower prices as they have not anticipated some of the risks. If these risks materialize, the contractor may not be able to bear them, which could lead to unexpected damages for the employer. In this context, collecting the most extensive and complete information may be costly, but it will pay for itself and often leads to the most economical contract price with minor surprises and risks. Moreover, the award will strive for the best value contract to ensure that there will be optimum tender. Such a contract may be higher in price in the short term, but will provide a better result in the long run. When considering a best value contract, factors such as quality, options, and incentives ongoing maintenance, and project lifespan are considered, not just the lowest price.
In contracting and tendering documentation, it is concerned with the accuracy, completeness, legality, and security of the documentation which supports the contracted activity. But what is the difference between contracting and tendering documentation? A tender is an offer to contractors to execute the specified works or to supply selected materials within a fixed time frame and per condition of the contract and agreement between the contractor and the owner. In contrast, the contract documents are the agreement between the owner and the contractor to execute the works specified in the tendered documents as per the contract condition on the rates quoted by the contractor. And there are 12 objectives for contracting and tendering documentation. First is to ensure that all stages of contract administration are supported by accurate, complete, and legible documentation. Next is to prevent and minimize the disruption, delay, and additional costs caused by documentation errors and omission. It needs to be accurate with all the details inputted in the documents. To ensure that all contract documentation is prepared in accordance with the relevant form of contract and regulations. Next is to ensure that all documents is securely stored and adequately protected from loss, damage, unauthorized amendment, or leakage. It needs to be held in the safest place because it has important details that an authorized person only access that documents. To ensure that the location of the to ensure that the location of documents can be promptly traced for them to easily access the documentation when needed. To ensure that only authorized and valid amendments are correctly applied to the contract documents. Next is to ensure that the only current version of the documents are utilized. Next is to ensure that all supporting information is correctly incorporated and to acquire required standards. Next is to ensure that the bus, securities, completion, certificates, correspondence, etc. are accounted for and are securely filed. Next is to prevent the premature or accidental disposal of the contract documentation. Next is to ensure that the status of all contracts can be determined promptly and supported by the relevant documentation. And lastly, to ensure that all relevant documents are retained and remain available for required period. And all the objectives mentioned must be complied when doing contracting and tendering documentation to have accurate documents that can be used in one project to avoid delays and complete the project on time. Selection and letting of contracts. Contracts represent the balancing of risks between the parties, and these are expressed in the form of documented rights and obligations. Selecting the most appropriate form of contract is often crucial in ensuring a fair balance of risks and rights. And this section examines the related issues. Additionally, it is necessary to ensure that the chosen contract is correctly enacted. And there are 12 of contract objectives for selection and letting of contract that must be considered. First is to ensure that the most appropriate form of contract is utilized and the risks are fairly balanced between parties. Next is to ensure that the optimum contract pricing method is selected for the circumstances. In this, both parties should agree with the pricing method that will be used to be fair. Next is to ensure that the organization is adequately protected in the event of contractor breach. Next is to ensure that the contract condition offers suitable remedies. Next is to ensure the accurate and correct completion of all contract documentation to avoid errors and delays. Next is to aim to settle disputes within the contract condition by mutual agreement to avoid misunderstanding about the contract. Next is to ensure that stable and reliable contractors are selected to be parties to the contract. Next is to ensure that all the key requirements, timings, and obligations are defined in the contract to avoid errors that can lead to misunderstandings of both parties. Next is to ensure that all contractual relationships are authorized. Next is to ensure that the contracts are correctly and legally enacted. Next is to ensure that all applicable European and international legal implications are correctly addressed. And lastly, to ensure that all contract documentation is securely stored and adequately protected from loss, theft, or damage. And that's all the control objectives of the selection and letting of contract that must be complied when making an agreement with both parties to ensure a fair balance of risk and rights.
Let us continue with the performance monitoring. All contracts are created for a purpose. All contracts are created to achieve identified objectives. In order for the company to be assured that the objectives is performed as intended, performance monitoring is needed. According to Parley Pro, there are ways or steps to be followed in doing performance monitoring. Number 1. You need to understand and have a knowledge about what the contract is supposed to achieve. It is easier to track the performance of the contract if you knew what specific objectives it needs to be achieved. Second, track milestone. Critical milestones are the dates identified in the contract by which the contractor must complete. This helps to ensure that everything is proceeding on schedule. Third, you should regularly review the positive and negative indications. Use the KPI or the key performance indicators, which helps measure the progress and achieve goal against contract. Fourth, always be prepared to take corrective action if needed. The following are the objectives of doing performance monitoring. The first one is to ensure that all relevant contracting and business-related objectives are fulfilled. Second is to ensure that the contract is completed on time and within the budget. Next is to ensure the quality, technical, and workmanship targets are met. Even if the project is completed within the time, must be ensured that the project is used in the long term. Fourth, to enable the monitoring and assessment of contract and consultant performance against the contractual obligation. Fifth is to measure all contractual obligations are correctly discharged. If both parties have properly complied their obligations that were set forth by the contract, then they are free from further liability. Next, performance monitoring ensure that all key contract events are promptly identified and reacted to. Next is to avoid the defective management of the contract or project. Performance monitoring helps in the management of the project as it helps with the flow of doing it. They address potential problems that can be solved by the management or by the contractors. Next is to enable the assessment of the relevance and effectiveness of the contracting management environment as the basis for identifying weakness to address subsequently. Next is to measure that any apparent problems can be dealt with promptly and effectively. It is better to solve the problem earlier than to face it on the near future. Lastly, is to ensure that the remedy or the redress is properly fought wherever relevant. Next topic is the valuing work for interim payment. Interim payment are determined in the accordance with the contract. This could be by such method as valuing the quality of work completed at stages identified throughout the process. Alternatively, it could be by any agreed amount to be paid at certain dates or when a milestone has been achieved. The following are the objectives of valuing work for interim payment. First is to ensure that payments are made only for work actually completed and goods and services received. Next is to ensure that payments are made only to the required standard and quality. It does not mean that because it is an immediate need, you will acquire an asset that will not last long. Next objective is to ensure that payments are made only prior to authorization. There must be an approval from higher ups for such payment as they need to know if it is needed to pay immediately. Next is to ensure that payment relates to contractual activity. This is to ensure that such payment is modified on the contract and that both parties agree. To ensure that work completed is accurately measured and correctly calculated using the defined methods and prices. Next is to ensure that the amounts are accurately settled within the time sales is stipulated within the contract. Next is to ensure that all HUT's stand charges are valid and supported. Lastly, it is to ensure that the correct value of retention is calculated and applied interim account.
Contractor's final account. Upon the completion of the project, the contractor will now prepare and submit their final account. What is final account? It is a statement which shows the sum of how much is to be paid when the contract is completed. The final account also shows adjustments such as if there are prior payments made or if there are any outstanding claims. As such, the employer will naturally wish to ensure that this statement is accurate and any effects of prior payments, outstanding claims, and retained values are accounted for. So what are the control objectives under this phase? First, to ensure that only valid, accurate, and authorized accounts are paid. This relates to how the organization confirm whether the accounts are valid and accurate before payment and whether the account need formal authorization before payment. To ensure that all accounts relate only to work actually completed or goods or services provided to the required standard. This relates to how the management ensure that the goods and services reflected in the final account are the ones actually delivered and that the accounts only measures as far as the completed part of the project. To ensure that all accounts are costed in accordance with the measurement methods and prices contained in the contract. This relates to how the management ensures the final account is costed or measured in accordance with what is agreed in the contract. To ensure that the contractor has met all contract obligations prior to account settlement. This relates to how the management ensures that the obligations of the contractor is satisfactorily met before any payment is made. To ensure that previous account payments have been correctly taken into account. This relates to ensuring that prior payments or payments made throughout the project are accounted for or deducted in the final account. To ensure that retained values have been accurately calculated and applied. This relates to what measures are in place to ensure that the retention and maintenance values are correctly calculated and withheld in the final account. To ensure that the price fluctuations have been correctly calculated in accordance with the agreed formula base. This relates to how the management ensures that the price fluctuations during the course of the project are properly reflected in the final account. To ensure that the values of any outstanding contractual claims are valid and have been accurately incorporated. This relates to ensuring that any outstanding claims reflected in the final account are valid and accounted for accurately. To ensure that the charges in respect of variations, modifications are valid, authorized, and correctly calculated. This relates to how the management ensure that the adjustments for variations and modifications are valid, accurate, and relate only to those agreed upon and authorized. To ensure that where applicable, values of liquidated damages are correctly incorporated. This relates to ensuring that if there are any liquidated damages, it is reflected in the contractor's final account. To ensure that all taxation matters are correctly addressed, this relates to what measures are in place to confirm the accuracy and validity of VAT and other taxation calculations. To ensure that any agreed damages due to any agreed damages due to the organization have been deducted. This relates to to measures, or what measures would ensure that the values of agreed contractual claims and damages due to the organization have been correctly adjusted on the accounts. To ensure that all key contract events reflected in the accounts are adequately supported by documentation. This relates to ensuring that key contract events are evidenced and what documentations are needed for them. To ensure that the amount is settled within any agreed period stipulated in the contract. This relates to ensuring that the payment is not delayed and the amount paid is not more or less than what is stated in the contract. This phase is basically about making sure that all amounts shown in the contractor's final account should be accurate and all adjustments and measures are in accordance with the stipulations of the contract. Review of project outrun and performance. After the project is completed, a post-completion review of the project is beneficial for the company. This ensures that all established objectives are achieved. And if the organization is regularly conducting such projects, it might help examine the project's progress and the extent of the project management framework's contribution. So what are the control objectives under this phase? First, to ensure that all contract and project objectives were actually achieved. This relates to how the management confirmed that all the contract objectives were fully accomplished. To ensure that all aspects of the contract and the contractor's performance are reviewed against expectations, requirements, and standards. This relates to how the management accurately assess how a contract was conducted as a means of identifying problems and shortcomings for their attention. To ensure that the contract management procedures and policies were reviewed so that they can be progressively improved. This relates to how the management obtained assurance that an existing contract management procedure and practices are valid, authorized, justified, effective, and are being correctly complied with. To ensure that all contract obligations have been satisfactorily met. This relates to reviewing the obligations in the contract to ensure that they are completed. To ensure that the contract was completed on time and within budget, and to note reasons for failures and shortcomings. This relates to how the management is assured that the contracts are completed on time and within budget, and what actions do they take in the event of a shortfall. To ensure that the accounting and management information systems are assessed for their accuracy, efficiency, and reliability. This relates to how the management assess the quality, accuracy, efficiency, and reliability of accounting and management information systems as a basis for their decision making. To ensure that all key contract events were efficiently and effectively handled. This relates to how important events are handled or taken care of and how the resources are used. To ensure that all key contract events were supported by adequate and accurate documentary trails. This relates to how the management undertake an assessment of the accuracy and completeness of the contract documentation system. To ensure that all non-standard events were suitably assessed, justified, and authorized. This relates to how the management obtained the assurance that all non-standard contract events were authorized, justified, and fulfilled. To ensure that all the relevant legal and regulatory issues were satisfactorily addressed and the most appropriate form of contract was applied in the circumstances. This relates to how the management confirmed the acceptability and relevance of the chosen form of contract, and it also relates to how the management confirmed that all relevant legal and regulatory issues were appropriately addressed. To ensure that the performance of contractors and consultants were fully assessed. This relates to how performance contractors and consultants were assessed against defined expectations, especially when they are to be considered for future contracts. To ensure that organizations' resources and staff are reviewed in the light of their performance during the contract so that administrative improvements can be made. This relates to how the management ensure that all the shortcomings, problems, and potential improvements will be highlighted and appropriately addressed so that future contracts are more efficiently, securely, and effectively administered. This also relates to how the management ensure that the organization staff and resources were efficiently utilized. And if there are shortcomings and problems, how are these addressed? To ensure that all conclusions and action points are reported, agreed by senior management, and subsequently authorized. This relates to how decisions are made throughout the project and how are they authorized and must be agreed upon. To ensure that any outstanding contractual obligations are identified and resolved. This relates to how the management ensure that all outstanding contract obligations would be identified and acted on. To ensure that the staff training and development needs are identified and addressed. This relates to what measures would highlight potential staff training and development needs and how are these to be addressed. The review of project outrun and performance is about evaluating whether the project objectives were met, to determine how effectively the project was run, to learn lessons for the future, and to ensure that the organization gets the greatest possible benefit from the project.